everyone, and welcome to the April Comfort Book Club discussion of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. As always, I'm joined by my mum, Donna.
Hello, everyone.
And I'm very much looking forward to discussing this with you
We've had a
and
right
with everyone else.
about it. Yes.
We really have. We've just been fascinated by our reread this time. We've got our cup of tea. I definitely recommend you getting a nice warming beverage. And we also have a little sweet treat, an old-fashioned fruit cake that Mum made very kindly.
Yes.
And I'll be sending out the recipe for this to my newsletter subscribers. So if you're already on my email list, then you'll be getting the recipe when my newsletter goes out on Sunday. And if you're not, then do sign up for my newsletter. I'll put the link in the description box down below. If you'd like the recipe to an old-fashioned fruit cake.
It's a good one.
Yes, and we thought
nice and easy.
We thought maybe the Dashwoods would have it in their little cottage.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it was so much fun rereading Sense and Sensibility. Yeah. Thank you to everyone who sent in a voice message as well to add to our discussion. One thing we really felt on this reread is we were talking about why it's a comfort read for us.
Yes.
And it's interesting because we both said how much comfort we got from this book, because it really is a story about resilience.
It really is. It's not things don't go easily for the Dashwoods at all.
No, exactly. And we admire Eleanor's spirit
very
especially
much.
So much. And even when she has to contend with some very difficult, if not downright unpleasant people, sometimes the people are just a bit silly, a bit foolish. Yes. Sometimes they really are nasty. Yeah. But I think what's amazing is that we recognise so many of these personalities.
Exactly.
Still.
All these years later, human nature doesn't change that much.
No.
You recognise, you sort of might have worked with someone who was a bit like that, or, you know, you recognise the types.
Exactly. So Jane Austen still speaks to us today. And another thing that we particularly noticed, perhaps because of our relationship, is how many mothers there are in this book.
Yes, mothers and daughters, a real theme of this one.
Yes, there is. And mothers and children more generally as well. And different types of mothers, and Jane Austen is quite harsh on mothers. She
is. I don't blame us when you look at some of the children that are in this one, right?
She's very against spoiling children, and a lot of the children are spoilt, particularly second children.
Yeah, that's very interesting,
in the novel,
isn't it?
Yes, because they're often favoured by the mother. Mrs. Dashwood favours Marianne.
Yes.
Mrs. Jennings favours Charlotte.
Yes.
And of course, Mrs. Ferrers favours Robert.
Yes.
Over Edward. And there's a bit of narcissism to that, because these second children most resemble the mother.
Yes, they do. That's right.
And you feel that this is why they're preferred by the parents, because they're most like themselves.
Yes.
But some mothers are definitely worse than other mothers.
Yes, I definitely agree with that.
Yes. And one of our listeners, Laura, sent in a message about Mrs. Dashwood. So let's hear Laura's message.
Hello, Miranda. Hello, Donna. This is Laura from Italy. Jane Austen never disappoints, and I truly enjoyed Sense and Sensibility. The character I could relate to most was Mrs. Dashwood. She's a good mother, even if she's not perfect. She has her flaws, she's often too sensitive, like Marianne, but she only wants her daughter's happiness. And as we read in chapter 3, she doesn't encourage intimacy from motives of economic interest. I particularly liked Eleanor's attitude towards her. She's quite protective, and she knows that her mother hasn't yet learned to govern her feelings. As a mother of a grown-up son myself, I know how comforting and sweet it is to realize that our children see our weaknesses, but love us all the same.
Oh, thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
And yes, I think Mrs. Dashwood is an interesting character because she is a flawed parent.
Yes.
But she is still a very likeable
Very
mother.
likeable, very loving mother, definitely.
And Eleanor is very understanding. I mean, she has an incredible maturity for her age, Eleanor.
She's
19.
Yeah.
And yet she really is the one who is able to advise her mother and who makes a lot of the biggest and hardest decisions for the family. And she also understands, I think, that Marianne is her mother's favourite.
She says that at one part, and there's no jealousy there. It's just that she understands how much her mother will be scared that Marianne will be, dead by the time she arrives, when Marianne's lying there ill. And she really understands that this is her special child.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you do know that's because they're so alike. Yeah. And Marianne, to a certain extent, is destined to follow in her mother's footsteps, in spite of declaring that she doesn't believe in second attachments.
Yes.
She, in fact, marries a man who has had a former attachment, just like her mother does before her. And you know that's really going to happen to Marianne when it's set up at the beginning that she's so against second attachments. You know she'll learn her lesson. But yes, I do like Mrs. Dashwood, even though she does have her faults. She still loves all of her children and wants the best for them. And by the end of the book, she realises she's been unfair and somewhat unkind to Eleanor too.
Yes.
She also grows as a person throughout the novel.
She does. I mean, at the beginning, she's obviously got no real ideas about money in many ways. Because she was planning all these extensions in the spring of their first spring in the cottage after they'd arrived, and you could just tell this was not going to be possible.
And it's Eleanor, as always, who has to be the rational one. There are some mothers that are seen as very selfish and only show any kind of real affection when it comes to their children. That's Lady Middleton and Fanny Dashwood, who both spoil their children, you feel, rather than take care to actually mother them properly and raise them properly.
Yes, I get that feeling very strongly.
Those children, you feel, are going to turn into terrible people and thoroughly spoiled. So they are not good mothers, even though they are really only most able to speak about their children. They have very sort of insipid conversation.
It's their only interest, really, isn't it? That's what comes out too. Is that, money and
their children. Yes, exactly. And so one other mother I find interesting in the book is Mrs. Jennings.
Yes, me too. We spoke about this. She's very interesting. Like, there's someone, she has a favourite. The second daughter, Charlotte, is obviously her favourite. And I think at one point Eleanor said she could forgive Charlotte anything because essentially she's kind and everything except for the laugh, which I think is very funny. And of course, she's a very silly girl, Charlotte, and you can tell that. Mrs. Jennings, I think, starts out being quite the comic figure, definitely. Yes. And you had a very interesting point about where the relationship with Eleanor really changes. She's always kind, but there's a point, isn't there, in it where it really does.
Yes, there is. Well, for one thing, obviously Eleanor and Marianne get to know Mrs. Jennings much better when they're in London. And Mrs. Jennings is shown, I think, more and more to be quite a motherly person who has the girls' best interests at heart, even if her intentions, are sometimes a bit misplaced.
Well, it's definitely to marry them off. This is what she did with her own daughters.
Yes, and she can get the wrong end of the stick sometimes too, but this is when Eleanor and Mrs. Jennings share this moment of humour when Mrs. Jennings misunderstands what Colonel Brandon says to Eleanor. She thinks that he is proposing to her, whereas in fact he's explaining to her about the living at Delaford, which he wants to give to Edward. And it's this hilarious misunderstanding that occurs between Eleanor and Mrs. Jennings. And when they finally understand that they've been talking at cross purposes, they share a laugh together. They have a good laugh over it. And this is a really important moment in the novel for me, because humor is a really interesting theme that comes up in the book. And the way that different types of humor are shown, Eleanor has a real sense of humor.
Very wry.
Very wry.
Yes.
And you as the reader often share the joke with Eleanor. She doesn't get to share it with other people in the book, but the reader forms this bond with her when she often is having to suppress a smile over what someone is saying, and you as a reader do the same. I mean, there's a bit where Mrs. Palmer is saying to Eleanor what a sort of taxing job it is for Mr. Palmer to sort of scour the countryside, trying to get people to like him.
So he'll become an MP.
Yeah, and how exhausting this is for him. And she says this in all seriousness. And Eleanor struggles to keep a straight face. And as the reader, you do too, knowing what Mr. Palmer is like. So you share a lot of these jokes with Eleanor in a quiet way, and your bond really forms with her because of that shared humour. But Eleanor doesn't often share a joke with other people. So it's significant when she can laugh with Mrs. Jennings. Because, of course, in the past, the jokes that Mrs. Jennings and Sir John Middleton have used to taunt poor Eleanor about Mr. F, for instance.
Yes.
Though that type of humour is shown to be sort of crude and vulgar.
Yes.
And not funny.
No.
And just a trial for poor Eleanor, and you really feel for her.
Really kind of childish,
yes,
I think
exactly,
is what you get the feeling. Yeah.
So you know how much they've kind of grown in their friendship when they're actually able to share in a joke together. And Mrs. Jennings really proves herself to be a lot of worth by the end of the book.
And you realise that she actually is a very good nurse, even with Charlotte with the when she has the baby, but also especially with Marianne. She doesn't desert them.
Yes.
She's there.
Yeah,
even if a little bit gloomy about it all.
Yes, but she kind of means the best, and she does prove herself to be motherly towards them and a good nurse as well. To Marianne, she feels like she's standing in place of a mother.
She says that, doesn't she?
Yeah,
yes.
she does.
Yeah.
So I think she's a character you come to like much more as the novel progresses, which is a bit unusual. In this book, people often aren't what they first seem to be, but you generally end up almost disliking them more as the novel goes on, Willoughby being the classic example. But with Mrs. Jennings, you realize there's actually a bit more to her.
And you're so right about she does understand, they laugh together. So rarely can Eleanor and Edward will share a joke.
Yes.
And often it goes over Marianne's head that he's teasing her.
Marianne is actually quite humourless. I mean, Eleanor describes her as being a very earnest girl, and she is. She's very serious. She doesn't understand when she's being teased, either by Edward or by Eleanor. But Eleanor can have a joke about it, and actually Jason sent in a message where he spoke about the different ways that Eleanor and Marianne speak in the novel, but there's also a little joke that he quotes. So I'll play Jason's message now.
Hello, this is Jason from New Zealand. My favorite quote from Sense and Sensibility is when Marianne says to Eleanor, "Our situations are alike. We have neither of us anything to tell. You because you do not communicate, and I because I conceal nothing." That is one of the most beautifully crafted sentences in Jane Austen's canon of work, and it distinguishes the sisters' witty personalities, right down to the way they describe the falling leaves of autumn. Marianne's sensibility leads her to cry out, "With what transporting sensations I have seen the leaves fall!" And Eleanor's practical sense grounds her to simply say, "It is not everyone who has your passion for dead leaves." And yet, by the novel's end, the core message is that we need both sense and sensibility to be sensible, so that we live and mature with the greatest possible advantage. Miranda and Donna, thank you for the timeless recommendation.
Oh, thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason. I love the bit about the deadly.
I know. I mean, I think there's an example of Eleanor having a little joke at Marianne's expense, but it goes straight over Marianne's head because she is surprisingly humorless. But I love that. And apparently I read that Marianne cries what she says more than any other character in any of Jane Austen's
so interesting, isn't
novels.
it? Yes.
She doesn't just say something like Eleanor,
she's a bit
cries
prone to hysterics too.
Yes.
You know, even at the end, the proposal scene, it's actually Marianne that goes off into hysterics.
Yes, well, when they hear that Edward is married, you know, poor Eleanor just sort of turns pale, but Marianne has hysterics. Yes. And I mean, of course, what is very central to this novel is not just the relationship between these two sisters, but in the way that one is meant to personify sense and the other is meant to personify sensibility. And they go through these parallel experiences, but of course both react to those experiences in very different ways. And in that way, Sense and Sensibility, like Northanger Abbey, is a book very much of its time.
It is.
In that it's preoccupied with this idea of actually it's bad for women to have too much sensibility, and Jane Austen is speaking out against a lot of novels at that time that praised women for fainting and having hysterics and being full of such sensibility and feeling.
Yes.
And Jane Austen always wants to make a case for women being rational creatures.
Yeah, very much.
Yes. But I think Jason is also right that she doesn't believe in only sense with no feeling. Her characters who don't have any feeling in the book are people like Fanny Dashwood, Lucy Steele.
Yes.
You know, Mrs. Ferrers, Lady Middleton. She is described as cold. So many times.
Really
these characters
frozen.
Frozen, cold, selfish, and self-serving. Jane Austen has no sympathy.
No,
for them.
I think what she frowns upon is a lack of feeling in others. It's you don't want too much sensibility, and you want to maintain your feelings, sometimes hiding them.
Yes.
You know, there's always the polite way to react in society, and Eleanor's always aware of that.
She is.
Marianne often just can't control herself. There's no control of her feelings.
Exactly. Whereas Eleanor feels very deeply, but is able to temper her feeling and control herself when she needs to, and does that through very unselfish motives as well.
Yes.
So Eleanor is the true heroine of Sense and Sensibility. I think Jane Austen wrote of the book at some point, I think to Cassandra, saying, you know, oh, my Eleanor. Like she loved Eleanor as a character.
I do too, and you do as well.
Yes, I do.
I think when you're younger, you see more sympathy with Marianne. I mean, she's in a horrible position, and you do feel for her. But I think as you read it again through life, you see more and more what strength Eleanor has.
Yes, she really does. And another of our readers left a message about how much she appreciates Eleanor as well. So let's hear from Anita.
Hello, Miranda, Donna, and all the Comfort Book Club readers. This is Anita from the US. I'm reading a quote of Edward's from the book. I was therefore entered at Oxford and have been properly idle ever since. On that note, I must say I look upon Sense and Sensibility as a story of Eleanor and Edward. While Colonel Brandon is a great character and drawn rather well, I cannot empathize with Marianne's heedless way of getting into muddles. But Eleanor sure reveals a lovely character through every situation, worthy of commendation. Goodbye.
Oh, thank you, Anita.
Thank you, Anita.
And yes, I do like Eleanor so much.
Yes.
Although I do have sympathy with Marianne as well, especially as she is so young. But another theme that is so integral to the novel that I wanted to discuss is money.
Oh, yeah.
there are so many exact figures.
Oh, I know. Everybody
book.
knows everybody else's like wealth too.
Yes,
you know, there's no
exactly.
secrets in that society.
No, not at all.
No.
And yes, you're right. They know sort of exactly how much an estate makes, for instance, and the financial circumstances of most, if not all, their acquaintance. And all these exact sums are mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
And again, it's people's relationship with money is shown to govern their lives. Willoughby, for instance, it's his avarice that
very
determines
much.
his future as well.
And he's a spendthrift. That comes out as well.
Yeah.
He has a very good income as he is, but he spends way above that.
Yes, exactly. And that's always points to a weak character in Jane Austen's world, I think. And yes, he's shown as unworthy of Marianne in the end too, because he counts money much more than true love in the end. And in that way, he doesn't have enough sensibility. The sensibility that Marianne thought that he had was really more of a performance. Partly put on to capture her.
Yes, and it saves Marianne in the end that he has so much avarice, because he basically he can't choose true love in a cottage because he knows he'd be miserable.
Exactly. Now Marianne is just kind of delusional in a way. She knows
she's so
absolutely
innocent.
nothing. She's so sort of ignorant.
Yes, that's right.
Yes,
that's right.
Of how much money you would even need to live in some ways.
Yeah.
She describes a competence, which is just the sort of like adequate amount of money to live, comfortably, but not in a lot of luxury. And she thinks you need 2,000 a year to get that. And Eleanor laughs at her because
she says that's my wealth, doesn't
exactly.
she? Yes.
Eleanor knows that 1,000 is about a comfortable amount, and it's true. Eleanor thinks 1,000 is wealthy, in fact, and that is about what you would have needed at that time. I think to have things like your own carriage and things like that, that would have been quite a lot of money to have each year. So Marianne is just shown to be incredibly naive and to have no real knowledge of the world in terms of practical things.
Not at all. I mean,
like
even when she describes how much it would cost to redo the room upstairs in the aunt's house.
Yeah, Willoughby's aunt's house. Yes.
And she says it's something like £200, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that's actually a huge amount of money. It is,
like an incredibly extravagant amount of money to pay, to spend on one room. And she just has no idea of how absurd she's being. Yeah. So it's interesting. The different characters' relationship with money shows so much about their personalities. And I mean, the tightest, meanest character, I think, has to be Fanny Dashwood.
Amazing.
And John Dashwood, of course. I mean, that's what unites them.
Really. Such a happy couple.
Their common love for money. And the beginning of the book, that long discourse between them, when it goes from him feeling he'll give each of his sisters £1,000 to them deciding that, maybe the odd bit of game shot on the land, the odd sort of gift
actually,
like that.
They'd be more able to give them money.
Yes.
That's just such a hilarious line.
I know. And you can tell in the end, they give them nothing.
Absolutely nothing. And I mean, she's so mean, she won't even invite them
to stay in London. Fanny, I know. I just think, that's one of the scenes that sets up that this is a comic novel. At the beginning, it's just priceless. And I think the film, that with the screenplay by Emma Thompson,
wonderful.
Did that so well.
Yes. Were they in a carriage or
for part of it? They were traveling down.
Yes.
And it's just so well done. And of course, Lucy Steele is another character who is entirely governed by greed, really, and
Definitely.
by
She even
self-interest.
steals from her own sister, doesn't she, to be
Yes,
able to
that's
go
right.
off. Leaves her sister without a penny, and I think it's Mrs. Jennings who steps in to help her.
Yeah, Mrs. Jennings does show that she is kind at heart, and she's more practical. Again, she's more aware of how much money you would need for things.
Yes.
So she's shown in a more sympathetic light as well.
And there's that scene where, again, poor Eleanor's the one who's sent. She's trying to, I think, sell some of her mother's jewels, and they in the jewelers. And she, first of all, it's Robert's there with a toothpick, isn't he?
Oh yes.
And that's a ridiculous amount of fuss and money to be spent on a toothpick is the
toothpick case. Yes, exactly.
Case, yes.
Yes. Just from that, you know that this is a wastrel.
Silly man. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, you feel Robert Ferrers and Lucy Steele are also made for each other.
You do.
In the end.
You do.
But speaking of Fanny Dashwood, Marie sent a message about this character in particular. So let's listen to Marie's message.
Hello Miranda, Donna and Comfort Book Club members. This is Marie in Canada. The character I'd like to talk about is the selfish and scheming Fanny, Mrs. John Dashwood, who talks her husband out of giving his stepmother and half-sisters a share of his inheritance. She convinces him that he owes nothing to those related only by half-blood, and that it would be unnecessary, if not highly indecorous, to do more for them than neighbourly acts of kindness. Later in the book, he wants to invite Eleanor and Marianne to stay with them in town, only for Fanny to elect to invite the Miss Steeles instead, a plan which backfires in spectacular fashion when she discovers that Lucy Steele is engaged to her brother Edward. For all her scheming, love triumphs in the end. Thank you for choosing Sense and Sensibility.
Oh, thank you, Marie.
Yes, thank you, Marie.
And yes,
she's the character you love to hate.
She really is. Yes.
Yes.
Such a despicable character. But Jane Austen, in all her novels, I think, and in Sense and Sensibility, it comes out as well. She's very damning of the sort of idle rich.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising that the two men who have professions of a sort, Colonel Brandon, who is an officer, and Edward, who wants to be a clergyman, are the most likeable male characters, and it's them who are rewarded with Marianne and Eleanor. And even though they're maybe not the most satisfying of heroes in some ways,
no, I mean, they're a bit flawed.
They are a bit flawed. In the end, though, this is a romantic comedy, good triumphs. It hovers on the brink of disaster.
It does. It's tragic. The tragedy is right around the corner with the illnesses and, even the destitution of Eliza. That really
is a shocking moment in the book, and it shows what could have happened to Marianne potentially.
Yeah.
But in the end, all does come right and love triumphs, which is what another of our readers, Christina, noticed in the book. So let's hear Christina's message.
Hi from Somerville, Massachusetts, everyone. This is Christina. So many awful things happen in this book. Eleanor and Marianne's mother, for example, is widowed, then later turned out of her home. Ultimately, though, genuine attachments prevail. People who are unreliable sources of support, like Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood, fade away. At the start of the book, they degraded to the condition of visitors, the elder Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters, and the couple received the same treatment from Austen in the final chapters. They just vanish. And it is real love that endures. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters, Marianne and Colonel Brandon, even Marianne and Willoughby in a way. All of the true bonds hold fast.
Oh, thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Christina.
And yes, it is interesting. Willoughby is one of the most interesting anti-heroes.
Yes,
I
think, find him so.
In Jane Austen.
Yes.
I mean, you see elements of him in Wickham, later in Pride and Prejudice. But Jane Austen kind of speaking through Eleanor, almost forgives Willoughby a little bit.
At one point, right? Yeah. Yes. I think Eleanor then reflects more. But,
she does.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, this
very
conversation that's kind of had around Willoughby, and there's almost this sense of regret that he was not good enough for Marianne.
Yes. I think we're left in no doubt that he would have just been awful.
Yes.
You know, he wouldn't have been able to stand Love in a Cottage at all.
No, not at all.
No.
And in fact, Jane Austen can't resist the sharpness at the end when she says something along the lines of, you know, of course he didn't pine away, hoping for Marianne. You know, in the end, he was just fine.
He was, and was often happy because his wife wasn't always in a bad temper.
That's right, and he had plenty of money to spend as well. But that scene where Willoughby visits Eleanor when Marianne is ill is an interesting moment in the book.
It is, and it speaks of the standards, the double standards of society too, that he can present himself as somehow being wronged by these, you know, girls that got themselves in trouble with circumstances.
Yes, exactly. He doesn't fully admit his own guilt, really, and it's only, I think, his incredible charisma that is shown to affect even Eleanor a little bit. But he is an interesting villain, I think one of the most interesting in Jane Austen's books. And Colonel Brandon is interesting too, because although some people do not like at all that he ends up with Marianne,
I really do.
Yes.
I think it works.
I think it works too.
Especially,
I mean, the age difference in those days was just a lot more
I think it's a couple of
obviously.
years, so she would have been 19 to 20 when eventually.
Exactly. And in a way, he's a much more romantic hero than Willoughby is, because he has had a tragic love in the past and all the rest of it. In some ways, he's more suited to Marianne's sensibilities.
Absolutely, and he appreciates her music and everything so well too.
Yeah, exactly.
I think,
but yes, in the end too, this is a romantic comedy, and that means that there are happy endings.
There are, and I rather love the picture she gives us, Jane, at the end of both. You know, the two women who marry, so it's Lucy and Mrs. John Dashwood.
Yes.
In fact, end up constantly, obviously, getting in squabbles with one another as the daughters-in-law, or the daughter and the daughter-in-law, and make quarrels between the husband, I think there is.
Exactly.
And,
whereas Eleanor and Marianne live so close to each other, very amicably, very happily, and they all get on so well, and you feel that is deserved.
Yes, I do.
But yes, it was so much fun to return to this novel. Thank you to everyone who sent in a voice message.
Thank you.
And as you know, the May choice is The Blue Castle by Ellen Montgomery, which we're looking forward to. And then we'll be having a bit of a break from the Comfort Book Club over June and July.
Yeah.
And we'll be doing a longer read, I think is what we're probably planning, a sort of fatter book, which we will then discuss in August. But we will make up our minds for sure about that
next time.
and announce it for next time.
Yeah.
So we'll tell you more about that in May. But yes, thank you so much again for reading along with us, and I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. And thank you too to everyone who pressed the super thanks button on my last video. I always so appreciate your support, but I appreciate everyone who comments or likes or subscribes to my channel. So thank you very much as well. And I'll see you again very soon. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.